Assalamu alaikum. I hope you're keeping safe and well in these difficult times. Since many of us are having to stay indoors for prolonged periods, I thought I'd recommend a book that I have just finished and share some brief reflections on it. The book is Heaven and Hell, A History of the Afterlife by Bart Ehrman, who is a distinguished biblical scholar and professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina. Today, the belief in heaven and hell is widespread and deeply rooted in our collective consciousness, and it's natural to think that it has always been the case. But it wasn't always so, and Bart Ehrman traces how the notion of an afterlife emerged and changed over time. He examines beliefs in the ancient world such as Mesopotamia and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and ancient Greek philosophy, and then focuses on early Jewish beliefs in the Old Testament, and how they evolved in later parts, right through to the sayings of Jesus in the New Testament, the letters of Paul, the imagery of Revelations, and finally subsequent apocryphal Christian works of later church fathers. He shows that the Old Testament, for most parts, regarded death as merely non-existence in the grave, where everyone went, good or bad. There was no doctrine of an afterlife, let alone a heaven and a hell. He says, "There is no place of eternal punishment in any passage of the entire Old Testament. In fact, and this comes as a surprise to many, nowhere in the entire Hebrew Bible is there any discussion at all of heaven and hell as places of rewards and punishments for those who have died." He then examines the New Testament and the sayings of Jesus, and shows that although apocalyptic beliefs had begun to emerge amongst some Jewish groups, views which Jesus subscribed to, Jesus did not preach the notion of hell, but rather that the wicked would simply be annihilated when the kingdom of God arrived, which Jesus believed to be imminent and would be on earth. "Some of those standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power." Ehrman explains that even Paul, who brought the idea of salvation through belief in the sacrifice of Jesus, did not preach eternal hell, but believed that those who refused to accept Christ would simply be annihilated. The idea of an afterlife where disbelievers would be punished was developed later by Christian church fathers who were faced with the reality that not only had Jesus died before the arrival of the kingdom of God, but time was moving on and many of the first and second generation Christians had now also died, while others were suffering terrible persecution at the hands of the Roman authorities, with no sign of the kingdom of God on the horizon. This led to a re-evaluation and adjustment of what the coming kingdom of God actually meant, and why God would allow his faithful to suffer such misery and die, while the wicked enjoyed power and luxury, getting away with their crimes. So it came to be believed that punishment and reward would come in an afterlife, and the kingdom of God was not an imminent earthly kingdom, but one that would take place after death. Their oppressors would suffer the same horrible tortures inflicted on believers. In fact, it would be worse, and they would not be allowed to die but suffer eternally, while the righteous would enjoy eternal bliss. Apocryphal literature such as the Apocalypse of Peter and the Apocalypse of Paul, and writings of other church fathers, detailed many of these gruesome tortures, something I mentioned in a previous video. For example, the Apocalypse of Peter describes bodies being roasted and intestines and entrails burnt, eyes put out with hot irons, sinners enveloped in a pillar of fire, idol worshippers thrown down from high places and driven back up by shayateen, then thrown down again, unbelievers tormented in chains of fire and cast onto coals of fire. Cyril of Jerusalem said, "If a man is a sinner, he shall receive an eternal body fitted to endure the penalties of the sins, that he may burn eternally in fire, nor ever be consumed." Lactantius said, "Divine fire will both burn the wicked and will form them again, and will replace as much as it shall consume of their bodies, and will supply itself with eternal nourishment." Cyprian of Carthage said, "An ever-burning Gehenna and the punishment of being devoured by living flames will consume the condemned. nor will there be in any way in which the tormented can ever have respite or be at end. Souls along with their bodies will be preserved for suffering in unlimited agonies. Felix Minucius said, "They would prefer to be annihilated rather than restored for punishment, nor is there either measure nor end to these torments. That clever fire burns the limbs and restores them, wears them away, and yet sustains them." Hippolytus of Rome said, "The unquenchable and unending fire awaits. No sleep will give them rest, no night will soothe them, nor death will deliver them from punishment. No appealing of interceding friends will profit them." As someone from a Muslim background, what struck me was the similarity between the descriptions of hell in this apocryphal literature, which would have been available at the time of Muhammad, and the descriptions in the Quran. It also raises a puzzling question. Why would the Quran's concept of hell resemble this very human apocryphal literature while being completely at odds with the Old Testament and the teachings of Jesus? Why would hell be absent from the Old and New Testaments when they form such an integral and much repeated element in the Quran? Although Islam accepts that the message has varied in some details according to the needs of the time and place, it insists that the core message has always been the same, namely, believe and obey the one God and gain eternal joy in paradise, refuse and suffer eternal punishment in hell. So its absence is not something that can be dismissed as a minor detail. Some may want to argue that the Bible has been corrupted and the references to eternal hell must have been removed. But why would anyone do that? And why then, after going to all that trouble, bring it back and make it a doctrine of the Church? Of course, I don't doubt for a minute that the many books that make up the Old and New Testaments have undergone changes and interpolations. But to suppose that such a central doctrine has been maliciously and meticulously removed requires one to believe that there was a concerted conspiracy of massive proportions spanning centuries, with people working together in different places and time periods, only to then bring it back in apocryphal literature. There is, however, another explanation, that the differences simply reflect the evolving views of human agents over many centuries, a purely human process that led to the notion of hell finding its most literal and graphic incarnation in the Quran.